All right, greetings, you little AP environmental turkeys. So we're going to do our final lecture for Chapter 4, which is actually a shorty. It's a relatively short one. I was going to tidy up the last little bits of info you guys need from Chapter 4, which does mean we're getting near the assessment cycle here. So anyways, next kind of big term, big idea in Chapter 4 is this idea of keystone species, right? And we'll find the text on keystone species there in Section 5, right? So today, this lecture will be going over Sections 5 and 6 from Chapter 4, which is pages 82 through 86, all right? So absolutely go back and follow up what you hear here with the reading, right? There's some important information that will be needed to get to, okay? Anyways, so keystone species. This keystone species is basically ecologists have determined in some ecosystems that one particular species kind of tends to be the glue, if you will, that holds the entire ecosystem together. So something about what that species does in the ecosystem sort of keeps everything in balance. All right, and there's a few examples out there, and we'll talk and read about some of them after we kind of go through this. But they exert a profound influence on the community. All right, and so they may not be very numerous either. Right, they might have a relatively low population, so maybe they're a top-level predator, for example. But if something happens to that species, if we would say we lose some of them for whatever reason, maybe to a disease or maybe some human influence, right? The whole ecosystem tends to get out of whack when that one particular species is gone, all right? And so those are what we call those keystone species, all right? And so one of the conservation goals, right, with our ecologists is to protect those keystone species because, again, if we keep those keystone species healthy and intact, it tends to also take care of the other species for us as well. I mean, it's not a catch-all necessarily, but it is a way to kind of get a big bang for your buck. So again, keystone species, they are really important in an ecosystem because they just tend to keep things in balance, all right? And protecting those keystone species helps kind of have an umbrella effect over an entire ecosystem often. All right? So, taking this over to the next big idea is what we call species richness. So with species richness, it's a very simple function of how many different species are present in a habitat. That's a simple definition, right? The number of species in a community. How many different types of organisms do we have? Now, this is part of a bigger term called biodiversity, which we'll get to in a later chapter. But for now, just understanding that we have lots of different species, that's species richness. And typically, it's a function of that producer level. The more complexity we have in our vegetation, right, we tend to see an increase in species richness. So this particular graph right here just shows different bird species as a function of how structurally complex the vegetation is. But we have a diverse array of producers. We tend to have a very rich habitat with lots of other organisms as well. All right? And essentially, it's the abundance or potential ecological niches. All right? So how many different niches can we support? All right? Is part of that species richness. So no big surprise, tropical rainforests have really high species richness. Whereas you have an isolated island, we're going to tend to have low species richness. And there's some cool things about islands called island biogeography theory, by the way. We'll get to that on a later date. All right, ecosystem services. Really, what we have to understand, this is kind of it's a really broad term, but what it means is what are the things that the various species do in an ecosystem that actually provide a service. And you could think of it really even as a service to us. All right? So within ecosystems, for example, forests especially, right, provide clean air debris. So there's a lot of gas exchange going on with our forests, right? So they're taking gigantic breaths in and out. And they you know, as we know from our photosynthesis and respiration discussion last week, forests are putting out some free oxygen for us, which is going to be really important. So, and in some cases, they actually even help to filter out toxins from the air. But again, that's actually another later chapter topic. All right, grasslands and wetlands and things like that actually are great at filtering water. They help to eliminate the buildup of some harmful materials. They help to filter out harmful bacteria even. Okay, and forests and grasslands also provide fertile soil. A lot of those nutrient cyclings that we'll talk about in Chapter 5, our next chapter. Carbon is cycled, nitrogen is cycled, phosphorus, sulfur, water, all those things, right? Essential for providing soil. A lot of those things are taken care of with these things like forests and grasslands and so on. So we call these things ecosystem services. All right. So why is species richness going to be important to us? Again, this is discussed in a lot more detail in Chapter 17, our chapter on biodiversity. All right. But for now, the greater the species richness, right, the more abundant ecosystem services we have, right? So the better we are able to provide clean water, clean air, and fertile soil if we keep that species richness high. All right. So one of the things environmental ecologists would study is how does species extinction as a result of human activity affect ecosystem services. Now, one thing I'm going to start pointing out and getting across to you guys now is ecosystems are exceedingly complex. Now, those of you who've already taken AP Bio, for example, you've looked at just how complex a cell is, right? What's going on inside a cell will blow your mind if you haven't studied cells yet, all right? So when you take this out to the ecosystem level, right, we're taking cells from one organism and multiplying it by some ungodly number, right? And then all the little interactions, biotic and abiotic, between organisms. It's extremely difficult to quantify or really pinpoint how one species, if we remove one species from this ecosystem, and it might be one of a million different species, right? If we remove one, what impact will that have? Will it have zero impact? Will it have an extremely profound impact? It's really difficult to pinpoint this. Now, this kind of cycles us back, you know, to our keystone species. Right? So we know that those keystone species tend to throw things out of whack, but it's really, really difficult to pinpoint or quantify a species extinction. But again, we can go back to this general rule. In general, greater species richness results in more abundant ecosystem services. So in general, if we have some species go extinct or become endangered or lose population dramatically, we would see some, likely some measurable impact on ecosystem services. All right? Although again, trying to quantify that exactly is next to impossible. All right. So one thing I encourage you guys to take a look at just to deepen your understanding of ecosystem services, all right, is this chart from the text. So if you go back and read, like I recommended, sections 5 and 6, pretty short read. There's this table, right? So it talks about some of the ecosystem services we find in forests versus freshwater ecosystems, grassland, coast, and so on. And yeah, you guys are likely to see a few test questions that pop up, maybe even from this table specifically. So just make sure you understand what an ecosystem is, first of all, and then you'll be able to give some examples, some types of ecosystem services we would see in these types of ecosystems. All right? I feel like it's pretty straightforward. And as I mentioned, this is a short one, so this should be our last slide, and there we are. All right? So that concludes Chapter 4 in terms of the lecture. So we'll be looking at that test soon, so stay tuned during class to hear about the exact date of that test.